Let's go ahead and get started. Good to see everyone. Excited about our speaker today, Austin Long. Austin started his career at the Georgia Institute of Technology in the Sam Nunn School, a BS, right? What was your major?
International relations.
That's a waste.
I started out in physics and nuclear engineering. So I moved there.
Right. Well, that is actually a common path for folks in this business sometimes. After Georgia Institute of Technology, he got a Ph.D. at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
I've never been to university.
What's that?
I've never been to university.
You've never been to a university, that's right, that's right. Well, except you taught at one.
Glorified trade schools.
He taught at one. He was an assistant professor and then an associate professor at Columbia, and then went to Rand as a senior associate, and of course now he is at the Pentagon on the Joint Staff, J5, nuclear policy advisor. I mean, he's basically in the room where your country is making, implementing policy and advising on policy on the defense side. One thing that I cannot leave out of Austin's bio is that back before he went to MIT, before he decided to pursue a PhD, he was a professional mixed martial arts fighter. I looked it up. I think your record was 2-1.
It depends on. It was 6-4 ultimately.
6-4 ultimately. So of course, but we kind of knew he was headed for the intellectual business because he wrote an article about his experience in the American interest. I brought a copy, and I just want to read you one paragraph. Actually, a paragraph in a sentence. It was. Actually, it's a really interesting piece. It was, what does the rise of mixed martial arts say about American culture, and is it barbaric human cockfighting or a noble sport? And he basically makes the case that, look, this is not that much more brutal, than what, professional football or something, or even boxing. But I particularly liked a couple of his. You can tell this is when you were at MIT as a PhD student. One paragraph: to understand MMA, you first have to state the viscerally obvious. Getting punched in the face is not pleasant. Even if one hasn't personally experienced it, this is intuitively understood by most more or less normal people. Having myself run this experiment many times from numerous angles, I can assure you that it is unpleasant whether one is standing, sitting, or lying down. Yet the root of much of the objection to MMA is the belief that it somehow is more moral to strike people when they are on their feet. And he goes on to cite the ancient Greeks and all the rest. Again, clear MIT headed to PhD. Later on in the piece he says MMA is at least on par with other contact sports in terms of danger and brutality. It's far from the total war that some imagine it to be. This is nowhere more apparent than in the middle of an actual war, which is where I drafted most of this essay at Camp Fallujah, Iraq, to be specific. So the other side of Austin, again, why I'm excited about Austin being here is the bridge between theory and policy that I constantly am kind of hammering home. In addition to his academic experiences and at RAND, he has served as an analyst and an advisor in Afghanistan to NATO and in Iraq to the one Marine Expeditionary Force. So he has an incredible blend of just what it is that I think we value most at SSB. Take it away.
Awesome. Thanks very much for the introduction. I will note that my last professional fight was 20 years ago this month. For those of you that are keeping score, I did not win. So first, let me say thanks to Jordan and Kier for arranging this. It's a great pleasure to be here to talk to you guys. Second, and it's on my slides too, but you can never say it enough, I'm here in a personal capacity. Nothing I say is attributable to the Department of Defense, the Joint Staff, or any other entity. So these are my personal views. So what I want to talk to you about today, let me get out of the way of the slides. Nuclear forces, command and control in the 21st century. So I'll talk. There we go. So I'll do a little bit of an overview of nuclear strategy and modernization in the United States and its two sort of principal great power competitors, Russia and China. But I want to spend a little more time talking about nuclear command and control because it's an issue that's a little more opaque and not often talked about, I think, in the way that it merits. So I'll probably talk for about half the time. I'm actually much more interested in having a dialogue and sort of questions and back and forth, but I want to put a few things on the table first. So first, United States nuclear strategy. I'll talk about declaratory policy, I'll talk about the role of nuclear weapons in US strategy, and then sort of what's driving a lot of that. A lot of this, for those of you taking Kier's course, I think this will probably be pretty familiar, but so the US has consistently maintained something roughly akin to the first sentence on the slide. That's from the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review. There was a similar sentence in the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review, and this has more or less been consistent in some variation throughout the past, really, 70 years. So the United States contemplates nuclear weapons only in extreme circumstances. We leave extreme circumstances relatively vague, but we want to make clear that this is not something we would contemplate just sort of routinely, that nuclear weapons would become a sort of normal part of the US arsenal. The thoughts for that were sort of in the 40s and 50s, but by the 60s, really, we had concluded nuclear weapons were distinct and not just a larger form of our artillery or conventional attack. Role of nuclear weapons in US strategy. Again, some version of this has been more or less consistent, at least for the past 3 or 4 decades. 4 roles that are articulated. First is probably the most important, deterrence of both nuclear and non-nuclear attack. Right, so the deterring nuclear attack on the United States and its allies is probably the principal role of nuclear weapons, but there's also a role for deterring non-nuclear attack, and the threshold for that is, like extreme circumstances, deliberately somewhat ambiguous in terms of definition. Second is assurance of allies and partners. We want allies, and I'll talk about extended deterrence in just a minute, but we want the US allies and partners to be assured that the US nuclear arsenal can and ultimately will be used to defend their vital interests. Again, we set a pretty high threshold for these things. Vital interests, not relatively important interests, pretty important interests, vital interests. Third, and here we get a little vaguer, achieve US objectives if deterrence fails. This is somewhat ambiguous, but one element that's talked about, again, consistently throughout the past several decades is limiting damage to the United States and its allies, at least to the extent possible. So damage limitation can be achieved in a variety of ways. One is to control escalation, so that a nuclear conflict would terminate with basically as few nuclear weapons as possible being used by anyone. Another way is to neutralize the adversary's nuclear weapons, right? So an adversary has used nuclear weapons, you would use US nuclear weapons potentially to prevent them from making further nuclear attacks. Fourth objective, this is one that I would say has probably become more important, or at least more talked about recently, is the capacity to hedge against an uncertain future. There was a belief, certainly with the last nuclear posture review, that the road to reducing the salience of nuclear weapons in international relations was pretty clear, and that the United States should take the lead in it. I think the United States still wants to take the lead in reducing the salience of nuclear weapons, but the road to that outcome is much less clear in 2018 or now 2019 than it was in 2010. And I think even the authors of the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review would probably agree with that. So what's driving a lot of this? It's the extended deterrent commitment to US allies and that need to assure allies that US will actually act on its extended deterrence guarantees that drive a lot of US nuclear strategy. Right? Deterring nuclear attack on the US homeland is, while paramount importance, is probably one of the lesser demanding roles for US nuclear forces. Right? The US needs to be able to retaliate against nuclear attack on its cities or military forces. That's relatively, again, I want to stress, relatively less demanding. To convince allies and adversaries that the US would not only use nuclear weapons to defend itself, right? So we might be willing, if someone attacked New York or Washington, D.C., we would retaliate, even though there might be further retaliation, to make it credible that we would be willing to put Washington and New York at risk to defend Paris, Warsaw, Seoul, wherever. That's actually a much more demanding bar. And then further, you not only have to convince adversaries that you're willing to do that, you have to convince allies. There are a variety of reasons why convincing allies of this is important, but a major one that I don't think gets talked about enough, it does get talked about, is if you want to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, having these firm commitments to allies is one way to do it. You don't need your own nuclear weapons, allies, because the United States nuclear weapons, again, in extreme circumstances, to protect vital interest, you can count on the United States' nuclear weapons. Absence those guarantees, it becomes a much more open question whether allies would pursue proliferation or not. And we can talk about that maybe in Q&A. So that's United States strategy. Modernization, the thing to bear in mind is most US nuclear weapons were last modernized before at least some of you and maybe many of you were born in the late Cold War. These systems are still reliable. We've done life extension programs on them to modernize certain components, but there are limits to what you can do. So one of the US primary nuclear capable bombers, the B-52, the last one rolled off the production line before I was born. Right, and well before I was born. And again, they've been modernized, they've been maintained, but you're talking about weapons that are, no kidding, approaching retirement age for human beings, much less aircraft. So the current US modernization program, and again, we can talk about this in detail in the Q&A, is essentially a replacement program, and some of these capabilities will be modernized, but for the most part, they're replacing existing systems. So we'll replace the existing intercontinental ballistic missile with a new one. The same thing with the submarine-launched ballistic missile submarine. DCA is dual capable aircraft. That's a fighter that's capable of delivering nuclear bombs. We're upgrading the casing on the bomb itself, and we're going to build a new bomb. But we have all of these capabilities already in the arsenal. We're just building new versions of them. The 2018 Nuclear Posture Review also called for two what they refer to as supplemental capabilities. These are capabilities that are not currently resident in the arsenal. The first is a low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile warhead. So we have submarine-launched ballistic missiles, we have warheads for them. It called for a low-yield option, that is to say one where the yield would be substantially smaller than the yield of the Hiroshima bomb, right? Whereas the current yields are significantly larger. The second is a new nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. So both of these capabilities would be Navy systems. Sea-launched cruise missile is sort of new. This would be a new version, but we had a version of it, a nuclear version of the Tomahawk cruise missile until 2013. So it was retired. This called for bringing it back. So those are the two sort of supplemental capabilities beyond this replacing and upgrading what we have. So moving on, talk a little bit about Russian nuclear strategy and its modernization program. So Russia's policy, as they've articulated in 2014, is on the surface somewhat similar to the United States, right? It reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to weapons of mass destruction and in response to conventional attack that threatens the very existence or survival of the Russian state, right? So they are a little more, they're a little clearer in what they articulate the circumstances of nuclear use are. The threshold is still pretty high, but it's a bit ambiguous. What exactly is a threat from conventional weapons that threatens the survival of the Russian state? Is the Russian state synonymous with the current leadership of the Russian state, or is it different? In other words, would Putin be willing to sort of sacrifice himself so that the Russian state might continue, or is he synonymous with the Russian state at this point? There's been a big debate in the open literature about exactly where some of these lines are drawn and what Russia's views on nuclear weapons are. One view is that Russia's publicly articulated declaratory policy is actually backed by a much more aggressive military doctrine that Russia would threaten and perhaps even use weapons coercively in a crisis or an actual conflict in order to terminate the conflict on terms favorable to Russia. So that this is a fairly anodyne declaratory policy that's backed up by a much more aggressive, real sort of employment policy. The counter argument is that no, actually the Russians more or less mean what they say, that they believe nuclear weapons are essentially one of last resort when the survival of the Russian state actually is threatened in a pretty meaningful way, that tanks are sort of rolling towards Moscow. You can sort of understand why this is something meaningful to the Russians in a way it might not be to a lot of people. We still have, just barely, but still have people that remember the Nazi invasion that are alive in Russia today. So this is a sort of visceral thing, and maybe this is appropriate. So there's a debate about this. The last resort could come quite quickly if you're facing a conventionally superior adversary. Again, the Germans remember the surprise attack of Nazi Germany and the fact that they were very quickly sort of on the brink of defeat. And of course, technology has come a long way and moves a lot faster these 70-odd years later. So that's a live debate, and we can talk about that more again in the Q&A if you want to. So what does Russian modernization look like? A bit like the United States, its last major modernization was the late Cold War. The Soviet Union collapses. Russia is not really able to maintain its nuclear forces for the best part of the 1990s. So 20 years ago, Russian nuclear forces were in substantially worse shape than the United States. They thus began their modernization process once they were sort of back on their feet earlier than the United States. So they're actually, relatively speaking, much closer to completion of their modernization. So part of it has been, like the United States, replacing old systems. So it's replaced modernized ICBMs. It's replaced an air-launched cruise missile. Same thing with ballistic missile submarines, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also developing a much more robust set of novel or new systems. So I showed the US had two, right? Two Navy systems, the SLICM and the low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile. Russia has, I've only highlighted 5, there are more. So the Poseidon Status 6 system you've probably heard about. This is an extremely long-range, nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed underwater torpedo or autonomous vehicle with probable transoceanic ranges, so they could shoot it all the way against the US coastline from near Russia. Buryavestnik is the name they've given to the nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed intercontinental range cruise missile. So this is basically is a cruise missile with a nuclear reactor in it in order to power it to intercontinental ranges. No one has ever deployed systems like these before. So these are quite novel in terms of delivery. Avangard is a hypersonic boost glide vehicle. So instead of traveling standard ballistic missile trajectory, it goes up and then kind of travels this skipping path. It makes detection much more difficult because it doesn't go quite so high up, so it's harder to see with radars, et cetera, et cetera. Kajal, which is a air-launched ballistic missile, so the thing sort of falls off the aircraft and then goes into a ballistic trajectory or semi-ballistic trajectory. And then SSC-8, which is the NATO designator for a missile the Russians call 9M729. This is a treaty-violating missile, according to the United States. The United States and Russia signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty over 30 years ago. We believe that the Russians started developing this more than a decade ago and began deploying it about 4 or 5 years ago. So this is a big deal. It's led the U.S. to suspend its commitments to the INF Treaty and to announce the formal process of withdrawal, which just happened at the beginning of this month. Happy to talk more about this in Q&A. We can also talk about why the Russians might be deploying these novel systems. At least for the first 3, their sort of stated reason publicly is U.S. missile defense, right? They believe they need a secure deterrent to convince the United States that it will face retaliation in a war with Russia. So obviously something that's traveling underwater is not going to be affected by missile defenses that are targeted at the upper atmosphere. Same thing with a cruise missile, it's going to fly very low, right? So things that are targeted as U.S. missile defenses are. Finally, Avangard, same thing. It's going to travel a different path that will make it much less susceptible to intercept. So that's the Russian argument. We can talk about in Q&A, how much you buy that argument. SSC-8 would probably be somewhat different. All right, finally. Chinese declaratory policy. China is quite different than the United States and Russia. They have maintained, basically since they became a nuclear power, a declaratory policy of no first use. This is the articulation basically from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 2005, and it's been consistently reiterated. China possesses nuclear weapons, but will not be the first to use them at any time or under any circumstance. They reserve the right purely for retaliation, and that's a lot of what they claim their force structure is about, is assured retaliation. You can attack us, but be assured you will face nuclear retaliation. There's been some debate, particularly in military journals in China, about the potential need to revise this. As China's global ambitions have grown, some people say, well, actually, we can imagine circumstances where China might actually want to use nuclear weapons first, and it would be legitimate to do so because China's vital interests would be threatened, much as the United States and Russia have articulated. Official policy remains publicly unchanged, but I would say it's an open question whether that will still be true in 10 or 20 years. Chinese nuclear modernization. First thing to know about China's arsenal is significantly smaller than that of the United States or Russia, but it's not bound by any arms control agreement, so there's no sort of upper ceiling on how big it can grow. And it's been expanding and modernizing its arsenal pretty substantially over the past several years. A new ICBM, a new-ish ballistic missile submarine, etc. And they're also working on a few novel systems. One is an air-launched ballistic missile of their own, and they've also been exploring hypersonic technologies as well. So I just wanted to put a bunch on the table that we could have much deeper discussion on, depending on where you guys want to go. But I did want to spend the remainder of the time talking about nuclear command and control. And I'll sort of apologize to Keir that he's heard this bit of the talk before. On the other hand, I've heard the same talk from Keir about 20 times, so I feel like this is only fair.
It's better every time.
It does, like a fine wine. It's better with age. So, talk about nuclear command and control, and of course, I make persistent and perhaps annoying reference to the movie Dr. Strangelove. If you haven't seen it, you should sort of probably leave this talk immediately and go watch it. You'll get more out of it. So what is nuclear command and control? There are really 5, and I should have put easy in scare quotes there, but 5 pieces to it. Planning, so what are you going to plan to do in peacetime with your nuclear forces if you have to employ them? Force management, which is both day-to-day and crisis. Where are the forces? What are they doing? What's their status? Situation monitoring, what's going on in the world? Are we being attacked? Are our allies being attacked? What's going on? Decision making. That varies, and that's probably the meat of the talk is the decision-making piece, but who makes the decisions? How do they make the decisions? How do they communicate these decisions? Which is the last bit, force direction. The president, in the case of the United States, has decided to employ nuclear weapons. How is that communicated to the forces? So, as I say, 5 easy pieces. So there are both technical and political components to nuclear command and control. The technical piece gets very technical, right? It's things like, radio frequency waveforms, like what are we going to listen to, what are we going to broadcast on? It's weapons security, how do you make sure that weapons can be used whenever you want them to, right? That they're authorized to be used, but they will never be used when you don't authorize them, right? So that's security locks and things like that. It's also standard operating procedures, right? How do we handle weapons routinely? All these things very technical. But really, it's also a political issue, right? And that it gets particularly to that decision-making piece, but it has consequences throughout nuclear command and control. So the always-never tension is the thing that encapsulates what I was just referring to, right? The ideal nuclear command and control system ensures that when nuclear weapons are appropriately authorized, they will always be employed, right? So there can be no doubts about things like retaliation. At the same time, they are never usable, and that's referred to as positive control. They are never usable outside of those circumstances, which is referred to as negative control. So that sounds, sort of simple to articulate. I can sort of put it on one slide. It turns out to be quite hard to get to in practice. So there are 2 sort of pieces to this that particularly make it challenging, right? That are related to both positive and negative control. And it's at the heart of the concept of strategic stability, which you hear quite a lot. And we can talk more about that in Q&A, but the sort of simple definition from the Cold War of strategic stability is neither side in a crisis has an incentive to use nuclear weapons first because the situation is stable. There's no advantage to going first. You're just as well going second, so neither side will actually employ the weapons. So one source of instability is the failure of positive control, and that's at the heart of Dr. Strangelove, right? That you can't have a renegade general or a renegade colonel or anyone outside of those authorized to make decisions, launch weapons. At the same time, you won't have accidental launch, right? Because that's equally problematic if you have weapons accidentally going off. The other is the fear of positive control, that your nuclear command and control system is vulnerable in a way that would create incentives for first attack. If I can just get the president, there's no system for using nuclear weapons, and I will have neutralized, however baroque an arsenal, I will have neutralized that arsenal by striking at the nuclear command and control. So those are the 2 sort of pieces you should be concerned about. So any nuclear command and control system should have a way of addressing both of these challenges. But again, tricky in practice. So there are technical solutions that you can pursue in terms of this pursuit of always never. One is redundancy and resilience in communications, right? I won't have one way of talking to my nuclear forces to direct them to execute. I'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Ideally, they'll be very different right? So they would be different parts of the radio frequency spectrum. Maybe some of it wouldn't be radio frequency at all. It would be landlines, etc. So redundancy and resilience in the communications piece. Same thing in early warning. You want to make sure that if you're being attacked, you know it quite quickly, but also that you can confirm it in ways that are not vulnerable, or at least less vulnerable to accidental warning, right? Because the last thing you want is to call the president in the middle of the night and say, oh, hey sir, we're under attack, there's 5,000 incoming nuclear warheads. Oh, wait one, sorry, that was an error, right? You don't want that to happen. So the way the United States pursues this is what's called dual phenomenology. We actually use two independent physical principles to warn us of nuclear attack. So one is infrared satellites that will detect ballistic missile launch. The other is radars that will then say, okay, if there's a missile coming on the trajectory that the infrared satellite told me there should be, I can look there with a radar and see something. And it's only when you have that confirmation from two very independent sources. So if there's something that causes an error in the infrared spectrum, you'll get it with the radar. If there's something the radar detects, but you haven't detected infrared launches, again, you can have confidence. So that's one way to pursue that. Use control systems, which I've already alluded to, so you can have integral to the weapon controls that require special code to unlock. You can make sure that maybe they have a two-man rule, so only if two people agree that they've received a legitimate order and turn keys, you can have launch. Finally, you can protect decision-making authority. You can create very hardened command centers that are less vulnerable to attack. You can create mobile command centers that are hard to locate and attack, etc. So there's a whole host of technical solutions you can pursue to try and get after this always-never issue. So here's a view, this is somewhat dated, of the US National Military Command System that sort of highlights a lot of that technical piece. So you have the NMCC there in the middle at the Pentagon. Then you have NMCC Site R, which is an alternate National Military Command Center that's somewhere. You've got the Combatant Command Center, so US Strategic Command can serve as a command center, and if need be, there are others. You also have in the middle airborne parts of the Nuclear Command and Control System, so the National Airborne Operations Center, which would sort of serve as an alternate command center for the president. You have Airborne Command and Control Post, and then the TACAMO aircraft. TACAMO is an acronym for Take Charge and Move Out. It's a Navy program. All these are ways to get airborne and stay away from potential sites of attack, again, to survive. You can see there's lots of redundancy in terms of different satellite communication systems, different warning systems, and that's essentially what you should take away from all those ridiculous arrows, is there's lots of different pathways to achieve the nuclear command and control function. There are also political solutions to at least some of these problems. So one way to avoid the decapitation problem, that there could be one or two people that if you target and kill, their nuclear forces are not operational, you can do pre-delegation of authority. In other words, essentially to say, I, the president, I, the prime minister, whoever, I will pre-authorize certain commanders to use nuclear weapons in emergency situations where I've been killed or am otherwise incapable of communicating with. So on the left is an actual declassified instruction for expenditure of nuclear weapons in emergency conditions, which was a letter given to the commander of U.S. nuclear forces during the Cold War that pre-delegated authority. The U.S. did this. This is from the Eisenhower era. It's clear from declassified records we did it at least through President Johnson. Depending on whose sources you believe, it's less clear, but we may have continued doing it even through President Reagan, right? So that if you kill the president, even kill the vice president, all down the line of succession, as long as the military was still intact, you could still have launch. So that was to convince adversaries that decapitation was not an option. Easy on paper, but in practice, you have to be very, very certain about the people you're pre-delegating to, right? Because you're giving them, in some ways, the ultimate authority. So do you trust them? How much do you trust them? What are the circumstances you want to predefine for them where they have authorization to use? So the British system is actually a little simpler, at least according to unclassified sources. Each new prime minister, when there's a new prime minister, sits down very early in their tenure and writes a letter. And that letter is sealed and kept in the UK's ballistic missile submarine that's continuously on patrol. And the captain is basically told, you only open this letter under these circumstances, which are essentially London is destroyed, and that will tell you what to do. And every time there's a new prime minister, that letter unopened, because we haven't had London destroyed, makes my family happy since my wife's from there. That letter is literally burned, and a new one is written by the new prime minister, right? But that shows an extraordinary level of trust in the British Navy and the British nuclear force. What do you do if you don't have that level of trust in your forces? So, talk a little bit about the Soviet Union, which did have this problem, and they did not particularly trust their military, and they had some other problems. So they didn't want to pre-delegate to the military because they didn't really have a succession that was regularized, right? So the US has elections, the UK has elections, even India has elections. In the Soviet Union, those of you who have seen the movie The Death of Stalin kind of know what the Soviet system was. It was everybody kind of scramble and figure out what's going to go on and start backstabbing each other. In those circumstances, do you really want to give the military the authority to use nuclear weapons? Because that might imply other roles for the military taking authority when the leader is dead, right? Which is sort of what happened in the movie, right? Not quite historically accurate, but hilarious nonetheless. The question then is, what happens when you get to the worst possible outcome, which is a leader who is not going to give up authority, but is in no shape to make any decisions whatsoever? Sadly for the Soviet Union, that's where you were in about 1980. Leonid Brezhnev, I won't read you the quote from my friend James Wilson, but it's basically accurate. Brezhnev was literally on his last legs. And the Soviet military was really worried about what was going to happen if he died suddenly, if he died in a crisis, right? You can imagine some sort of crisis with NATO, and that guy pictured there who can barely stand up, keels over dead right in the middle of the crisis. What do? He was the guy who could authorize nuclear use. So, the Soviets started thinking about it. So they said, what if you create a deterrent that under certain pre-specified conditions would automatically or semi-automatically authorize the launch of our nuclear forces? That way we don't have to rely on that Brezhnev guy or whatever old guy is going to follow him, because they're all really old. We can connect it to some sensors. Sounds like a good idea. It would sort of then send out a go code. It'll be great. It would be a sort of doomsday machine. Nobody would ever do that, though. That wouldn't be a practical deterrent. Well, the Soviets actually did do it. They built something called the perimeter system. It was a system that relied on super hardened command centers that were remote in the Soviet hinterland, emergency rocket communications, allegedly a series of sensors, and basically an on-off switch and a timer. In a crisis, you could turn it on and set the timer for however long it was set for. You would tell the guys in the command center, if the timer goes off and you can't reach Moscow, in other words, you call home or Moscow calls you, you get nothing, you're authorized to launch, right? It was a way to, under very tightly semi-automated circumstances, pre-delegate authority without then going the full distance and politically pre-delegating authority and just saying, Soviet General Staff, you got this if the General Secretary is dead. So the system was, as I said, it was called perimeter. It was officially via Ruka, the dead hand, right? This idea of even if we're all killed, the dead hand will retaliate for us. And it's been reported by Russian leaders to still be in operation today. Whether you find that reassuring or not, probably your mileage will vary. So I'll conclude here. NC2, Nuclear Command and Control, is a major factor in strategic stability, but it is not a purely technical issue, right? That's one of the things that often gets lost in these discussions about nuclear command and control, is people focus on that technical piece, the slide with all the arrows I showed you. That's really important, but it is not the fundamental questions about nuclear command and control. So you have to look beyond just those technical pieces at the things like civil-military relations in a regime to sort of understand why they build the command and control they do. Here I just highlight, the DPRK, North Korea, is going through some of this right now. They've built a nuclear force. How are they going to command and control it? So there are two views about how they might do this. Again, I won't read you the quotes, but the first one is from Kieran and I's good friend Vipin Narang at MIT and one of his colleagues, basically saying the only thing that makes sense is to assure retaliation, right? So you have to have some form of pre-delegation, or maybe you could put together the DPRK equivalent of perimeter, but something that will make sure the system fails deadly if the United States seeks to kill, or South Korea, or anybody else for that matter, seeks to kill the leadership of the DPRK in order to neutralize its nuclear forces. That's one view of the situation. Another view is the one in the second quote. Actually, the DPRK looks a lot like the Soviet Union, right? It's a party-led state. They don't have regularized succession. I mean, they sort of have a hereditary system, but that's kind of worked out more in practice than sort of de jure. Kim Jong-un may actually fear his military and pre-delegating the military the authority to use nuclear weapons. So he might actually want a system that fails relatively safe to ensure rogue commanders or people that get funny ideas about coups aren't able to command the nuclear forces. So these are open questions, but I think if you look beyond the purely technical side of NC2, you'll start to have a better appreciation for what goes into it. I'm happy to talk more to the extent I can about U.S. nuclear command and control. Most of you probably have followed. There's been a lot of discussion about the president's authority to use nuclear weapons. Congress has actually put forward legislation that's not been passed that might in various ways restrict that. So I'm happy to talk to the extent that I can about that, and I'll stop there.
I'll let you handle.
Great. Hopefully there was something in there you want to ask questions about or make a comment on. Or not. Way in the back, yes sir.
Thank you for the talks. My name is Benito. I have a question about extended deterrence in Japan.
Yep.
In Asia. The picture back there, and also China has been, I think, modernizing their nuclear forces.
Mm-hmm.
So, what have DoD or the U.S. government have taken? Have they taken new steps, considering these kinds of development in situations, to further reassure its allies, Japan, ROK, and other Southeast Asian countries, to make their extended deterrence credible? I understand there have been consultations between governments to talk more concretely about this, but have DoD or the U.S. government have taken?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of partially answered your own question. I mean, there are a lot of consultations with both the Republic of Korea and Japan about defense planning, about extended deterrent commitments, things like that. In terms of practical force structure changes, I mean, at least in theory, some of the capabilities I talked to in terms of supplemental capabilities would be applicable in East Asia, right? I mean, that was one view of what the nuclear version of the Tomahawk Sea Launch Cruise Missile was, is it was a theater system that could be deployed in Asia to reassure allies, particularly Japan, without having to be deployed on land, right? That was always one of the big issues with extended deterrence and nuclear commitments in Japan, was the Japanese government, for understandable reasons, did not really want nuclear weapons on its soil. It turns out that it's now been declassified. There were U.S. nuclear weapons in Okinawa until the 1970s, but since then, at least officially, there have been no nuclear weapons in Japan. So the Sea Launch Cruise Missile was, for a long time, thought to be a major part of the extended deterrent to Japan. So you could see how that could be applied there. The same could be true of the Sea Launch Ballistic Missile. The United States is also modernizing the rest of its nuclear forces, as I talked to. So dual-capable aircraft, the F-35, which is going to be the U.S. new fighter bomber to deliver nuclear weapons, potentially has a role in East Asia as well. So there have not been sort of major force structure changes, because the United States thinks its nuclear deterrent is more or less okay. It's just old. It needs modernization and replacement. So most of what's been done has been the kind of consultation you talked about in terms of sharing intelligence, sharing plans to the extent possible, etc. I'll go left, my left to your right. So.
Hi, I'm Daniel Siegel. So my question is about hypersonics.
Yep.
How much do you think that the creation of this technology is actually going to affect the strategic balance? Because from my understanding, people like James Acton have done a lot of research showing that, at least for Chinese systems, they don't really go that far yet. I think 2,000 kilometers as far as they've been able to get them to go in about 7 or 8 tests. And then it's also unclear, how survivable, Russian systems have been. does the development of these systems that just get there faster actually change the way that the U.S. because the number of warheads we have in our arsenals aren't changing, right? It's just like how we deliver them. So I guess I'm trying to understand the strategic impact of these systems, especially considering they're not intercontinental yet.
Right. So I think a lot depends on the context, right? Particularly for range. So hypersonic systems probably have a lot of importance on, say, the Indian subcontinent, where that could really affect early warning in terms of what people detect. It will be somewhat less true the longer the range is. I think those weapons will eventually have intercontinental range. There's no physical reason to believe they won't. There, the issue, again, my perspective, is it starts to complicate some of the things I talked about in early warning, right? So if you want to rely on dual phenomenology, and that says, okay, I'll detect the heat from a rocket motor, and then I'll detect the warhead at the top of its trajectory. If the warhead doesn't go ballistic, you still detect the heat signature, and then it basically goes sideways. You won't detect it on radar until it's relatively close, right? Because you have the radar horizon. Then you might be talking, well, I can give you one phenomenon warning pretty quickly, but I won't be able to give you that second phenomenon until very, very late. That, I think, could have implications for stability in terms of the potential for decapitation. Yes, sir.
So, kind of post James Millar, by the way, post Precision Revolution, how has Russia tried to deter kind of that mass conventional precision strike that might have that shock and awe effect of disabling a large amount of their force? How they aim to deter that, and how has their command and control, nuclear command and control, differed from their conventional command and control, and are they blurring the lines there?
So, in terms of deterring mass aerospace attack, I argue, again, this is my own view, I want to be very clear, I'm not speaking for the department. I think the Russians have pursued basically a portfolio approach, right? They want to have as many different tools in their deterrent toolbox as they possibly can, given what is a large but still relatively finite military budget. So they've done the modernization and novel systems I talked about on the nuclear side. They've built their own conventional precision strike systems, right? So the SSC-8 that I talked about is believed to be dual capable. It could carry a nuclear warhead, it could carry a conventional warhead. That's true of a lot of their systems. So they've shot conventional versions of their air-launched cruise missile and sea-launched cruise missile into Syria, but they're obviously nuclear versions of that. So they have their own precision strike arsenal. They've built a lot of air defense systems in order to try and blunt a conventional precision strike attack. They've also done other things, right? You've probably read in the press a variety of cyber operations the Russians are alleged to have undertaken to potentially hold critical infrastructure at risk in various countries. And then, finally, again, press reporting is the Russians have sort of renewed their interest in the potential to cut transatlantic or transoceanic cables, right? So this is let's have lots of things we can potentially do to deter attacks so that we don't have to rely solely on nuclear weapons. The downside is that's a fairly finite toolkit, right? And the Russians haven't been able to build sort of an infinite quiver of all of these capabilities. So they might nonetheless, in a conventional conflict, run through those pretty quickly. You gonna stop if I do this? No. You gonna stop if I do this? What if I shoot precision? You're not stopping? All right. Still time for nuclear weapons, right? So that's my view of where the Russians are in terms of dealing with that. In terms of the command and control question, the Russians, unlike some other countries, I think have maintained a pretty robust and very redundant set of nuclear command and control pathways, right? So if what they've said publicly about perimeter still operating, I mean, that's their ultimate fail-safe. Even if you blow up the rest of our command and control, if that system is operational, we can have confidence in retaliation. So that, I think, is still, at least, again, according to the open source and what the Russians themselves have said, still pretty robust. That may not be true of everyone else. I don't think the DPRK is there, for example.
Thank you.
All right, way in the back, and then I'll
A
move
short,
left.
open-ended question. What is the U.S.'s end goal for non-proliferation with nuclear weapons?
I mean, I could give a somewhat facile answer, which would be say, well, we signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It says one day there will be no nuclear weapons, and it'll be great. But like everybody has signed up to that. I think what you're really asking is what's the sort of maybe medium-term goal. And there I think the United States really is committed to non-proliferation, right? That it wants to meet its commitments under the NPT to disarm. We've gone quite a long way towards that in the New START Treaty, and we've come down, by nearly an order of magnitude in terms of warheads since the Cold War. So the U.S. has come a long way on that. The issue is, there was a belief that I think the 2010 Nuclear Posture Review embodied, which was, the world is moving towards a world without nuclear weapons in a way that it hasn't in previous decades. The United States can take leadership and sort of accelerate this. And I think, unfortunately, what we've seen, at least in Russia, China, and the DPRK, is more or less the opposite, right? That other countries are seeking to expand their nuclear arsenals. So I think the U.S. ultimate objective still remains the elimination of nuclear weapons. But even people that were really committed to that, like President Obama said, I don't know if I'll see this in my lifetime, right? So I think that goal is still there, and is still the U.S. is still very committed to it. But it's tricky to get to when you're in a sort of turbulent geopolitical situation like we see today. So I realize that's not a overwhelmingly great answer, but I think it has the virtue of at least being true. All right, I'll swing over here. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a little bit about what you think the implications of the U.S. leaving the INF Treaty would be, particularly on the Russian side? Because I think a lot of people kind of throw out ideas of what they think Russia's goal is in violating the treaty, or why they would do that, or why they wouldn't at least pretend to, say that they weren't violating the treaty, and what you think their goals are.
Sure. So this, in some sense, requires answering a question that's puzzled me for years now, which is why the Russians decided to cheat on the treaty rather than just getting out of it, right? They had a fairly easy path to getting out of the treaty, right? They could say, look, we had this Cold War architecture, it doesn't fit our security environment anymore. You, United States, said the exact same thing about the anti-ballistic missile treaty in the early 2000s. You said, hey, this was a good treaty, when we signed it 40 or 30 years ago at the time, but it doesn't fit now. The Russians could have done the same thing. Their argument, maybe they thought they'd pay a political price for it. They thought they could maybe get away with cheating. It's tough for me to say exactly why they decided to go about it in the way that they did. Russian military political decision-making gets a little convoluted in the Putin era. There's bureaucratic interests. There's maybe the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing issues. So it's just tough for me to say. But that said, the United States publicly called them out on this violation nearly 5 years ago. Since then, they have more or less stonewalled. Their initial story was, you haven't told us enough about this alleged violation for us to really comment. We say we're continuing to comply with the treaty. The more we sort of told them, the more they said, well, there's no missile called 9M729. Oh wait, that missile, oh my bad. No, that missile's totally treaty compliant, right? So they just had a public display of the system, but not the actual missile, right? Just a canister in Moscow a couple of weeks ago, saying, oh yeah, well, now let's talk. The U.S. perspective is, look, the only reason you guys even agreed to do that is because we said we were going to get out of the treaty. Are you really serious now about coming back into compliance? But from the Russian perspective, there's nothing to come back into compliance on. That missile is treaty compliant, according to the Russians. So the big question is what happens now? So the United States has done a lot of outreach to its allies, particularly in NATO. NATO has been very supportive. When Secretary Pompeo made the first announcement about suspending U.S. compliance with the INF Treaty in December, NATO was right there. The allies seem to continue to support the U.S. viewpoint that arms control is not arms control if only one side of an agreement is adhering to it. So the U.S. has now begun research and development on its own intermediate range ground-based systems. There's money that Congress set aside for that. In terms of what the Russians will do, there's one argument that says, well, it was worth staying in the treaty because the Russians had to sort of sneak around to deploy these systems, but now that they've suspended compliance just as the U.S. has, their sort of gates are open and they can deploy lots of these things. It could be true. A lot depends on that perspective in how much you think the Russians were actually constrained by the treaty. The US has said publicly they've deployed at least 3 battalions of the system, which is not nothing. So the question then is, can they suddenly, okay, turn it on and they'll have 10 battalions in 2 years or something? Does that trade off with other systems? Potentially, right? So how much spare capacity and spare cash do you think the Russians have? So I think there's just a lot of unanswered questions about what the Russian capabilities to do more are. They have said publicly that they think they'll deploy a ground launch version of one of their sea launch cruise missiles, one they've used in Syria. So that might be a mechanism for them to add more intermediate range systems quickly. But I just don't think we know. So a lot, I think, depends on your judgment about what the Russian capacity to start building new systems very quickly is now that they have the political opportunity to do so. Yes, ma'am.
With respect to the new T-line variant,
Yep.
is there an expectation that those will be retrofitted onto like a guided missile submarine, onto a fast attack? Is that going to be incorporated into the new Columbia class? Are we going to is the plan to kind of keep the ballistic side onto the BNs and then have to incorporate it with the Columbia, or to adopt more of a like GN fast attack structure?
So I don't think there is a plan currently to replace the Ohios that have been converted to SSGNs. Like I don't think we're going to have a Columbia variant that's an SSGN. But I do think the thought is it could be in Virginia payload module, right? Things like that. I mean, it's going to be, whatever the next generation land attack missile is, it will presumably be compatible with any delivery system capable of shooting that. So that could be VLS or whatever the future is. So I don't see it going onto ballistic missile submarines. There's no reason it couldn't, right? The multi-magazine module that we put into SSBN tubes to make the SSGN in the first place, you could put those somewhere on SSBNs. But I don't think that's the plan. I think the plan, at least to the first order, is that this will multiply your nuclear strike options in the way that the former Tomahawk nuclear version did. Could be on surface ships. So that I think is at least the initial thinking. But look, this was just sort of something the NPR committed to looking at a year ago. So there's still a lot of looking that's being done in terms of what to do about it. Yes, sir.
So someone else brought up HGVs earlier.
Yep.
And you touched on the problem of early warning detection, right? So we withdrew from the INF, introduction, successful tests of hypersonics, and now the Russians possibly deploying or having deployed GLICMs with nuclear warheads. Do you think that ballistic missile defense, that the juice is worth the squeeze with reduced warning time?
Yeah, I mean, yes, but it just gets more complicated, right? I mean, so we just had a missile defense review released, which maybe some of you have seen. It articulates a pretty ambitious agenda, right? In terms of the potential for space-based interceptors that could be looking down at an HGV and intercept sort of in the upper atmosphere, at least potentially. It also talks a lot about, what I probably shouldn't but can't resist referring to as pre-boost phase missile defense, right? Which is offensive operations to neutralize missiles before they're launched is a big part of comprehensive missile defense. Again, whether you find this reassuring or not depends on what you think is important. If you want to deter someone by indicating you actually do have the ability to limit damage from a conventional or nuclear attack, it's pretty important. If you think that starts creating the kind of incentives that lead to real serious crisis instability, it's potentially a problem. The Missile Defense Review talks a lot about the importance of missile defense as a way to be stabilizing because you don't need to pursue those offensive actions. And that may be true for some adversaries, right? A really robust missile defense architecture could probably do quite a lot against the DPRK's arsenal, and therefore still shouldn't threaten the Russian arsenal, right? China then becomes this kind of in-between case where it's much bigger than the DPRK, but at least for the time being is not as big as Russia. So how should China feel about this? Your question was, is it worth the squeeze? And I think it still is in certain circumstances. One of the problems you run into that I just alluded to, though, is if you build capabilities to deal with small adversaries, right, big adversaries may think it's nonetheless targeted at them, and it's the thin end of the wedge. So the Chinese have been quite annoyed at U.S. deployment of the THAAD system to South Korea, right? We deployed theater range missile defenses in South Korea. The obvious purpose of that from the US perspective was about the DPRK, but the Chinese were concerned about it. And I think that's, I won't say it's inevitable, but it's pretty tough to get around, particularly when you talk about the potential for offensive operations against missile systems as well. Yes, sir.
Do you think that if Iran were to develop its own effective nuclear program, that Saudi Arabia would then demand their own effective deterrence? Or do you think our partners in the region would credibly believe that the U.S. would come to their defense, move them to attack?
So I think the U.S. would have to do a lot more in terms of the assurance piece that I talked about. I mean, we don't have the kind of robust extended deterrence architecture that we put into place in Europe and East Asia. I mean, we have some commitments there. But the other complicating factor is the Israeli question. Israel allegedly does not have nuclear weapons. That doesn't necessarily pass the Giggle test, but if there's an Iranian program, then that sort of frees the Israelis up, and then Saudi Arabia is not looking at sort of one country in the region with nuclear weapons, but two. And one of those countries is a U.S. ally. So what do U.S. extended deterrence guarantees mean for the Israeli-Saudi relationship, which actually looks pretty good right now, but hasn't always, and one can imagine it won't always look good in the future. So I think it gets really complicated if there's an Iranian nuclear deterrent, and I think it has all kinds of stability implications. Now that said, there are some people that basically say, if Iran has a nuclear weapon, like Saudi Arabia will call Pakistan and have a nuclear weapon the next day. I don't think that's necessarily true either, but I think it gets really complicated for the U.S. to extend deterrence in a really robust way to Saudi Arabia, the way it has to the ROK, Japan, and NATO. So I think it becomes really sticky, which is part of why there's been such an effort, and why even countries like China and Russia have signed up to try and restrain to some extent Iranian proliferation, because it just gets really messy for everybody. Yes, sir, in the back.
Thank you very much for your informative presentation. There's a wonderful episode in Yes Prime Minister where they talk about Russian salami tactics, slice by slice, trying to undermine their enemies, and trying to avoid triggering extreme circumstances such as the right-out invasion of Warsaw. And we've seen similar tactics by the Russians in South Asia and in the Crimea. Therefore, my question is, how will the US react to this type of advancements when it never really justifies the extreme conditions of such a destructive weapon?
So, again, speaking just for myself, I'm less worried than a lot of people are about the potential for, you call it what you want, salami tactics, gray zone tactics, hybrid warfare. There have been a lot of terms thrown around about this kind of approach. Than a lot of people are. The places where you've seen it have been places that were not really U.S. allies, right? Georgia is a U.S. partner, but not part of NATO, right? Ukraine, not part of NATO. So if you look at what happened in Georgia, what happened in Ukraine, I mean, this looks like, yes, there's the so-called little green men, but ultimately what happens is Russian use of conventional military power. I mean, you have seen in Ukraine tank battles in Europe for the first time since World War II. I mean, no kidding, like, where's Rommel when you need him kind of tank battles. This is not something NATO doesn't know how to deal with. NATO knows how to fight a tank battle. We haven't done it in a long time. We maybe need some more tanks, but this is not something that I think is quite as ambiguous as people think it is. Yes, the thin end is, right? But if you go talk to even some NATO allies in the East, you ask them what's going to happen if little green men show up, and they say, well, we'll shoot them, right? Because we have police, right? Ukraine was a state that was tearing itself apart when the Russians intervened. So my concern would be more that we know how to deal with that piece, but people may think that NATO doesn't know how to deal with this. And so then you may have something that starts to escalate, right? And you have a conventional conflict that escalates. I think that's a real concern, but I'm not as worried about it, as I say, as some people are. Because if there's a really large conventional war, it will eventually go NATO's way. I mean, this is a big difference with the Cold War, right? The Cold War, the fear was NATO was conventionally inferior to the Warsaw Pact. They had more divisions. They could eventually push NATO conventionally off the continent, and the US was never going to be able to sort of launch D-Day Part 2 to get back onto the continent. Not the case anymore, right? For good or for ill, NATO's borders are much further closer to Russia, and Russia is not the Soviet Union, right? If you look at just economically, NATO plus, NATO, Europe plus the United States, so more than an order of magnitude bigger than the Russian economy. Like the Russians will not win the conventional war. The concern then becomes not whether the US will use nuclear weapons, but if there's some kind of misunderstanding that leads to a conflict, will the Russians use nuclear weapons? Will the Russians use the threat of nuclear weapons to try and terminate a conflict on terms favorable to themselves? To me, this is much more of a concern than would the US use nuclear weapons to kill little green men or a couple of T-72s. That's not really the question. The question is when does Russia use nuclear weapons? Yes, sir.
Yeah, so I hate to be the guy to ask about lasers, but barring anybody else. So in the Missile Defense Review, and actually I was hearing Sam Greaves speak about, the head of the MDA, speak about that more, talking about a future kind of component of possibly GauSS technology, laser technology. I guess my question is, where does that operationally fit in on a timeline, or is that something that we're perhaps fearful to field for fear of it, affecting some kind of security dilemma with Russia, or is it something that just doesn't actually have the bang for the buck, so to speak, versus focusing on missile interceptors?
So I think directed energy, so that could be laser, that could be, charged particle beams if we're going back to the 1980s. It could be any kind of directed energy, directed microwave. I think there's a lot of potential. One thing that people highlight is the magazine issue, right? You're going to, shoot down missiles. You got to have at least one interceptor. I mean, the NDR talks about, being able to have multiple kill vehicles on a single interceptor, but still, you got to have, a number of missiles. They're quite expensive. So you'll have a finite magazine. The plus side of directed energy is, functionally, as long as you've got power, you've got shots, and you could potentially cycle through pretty quickly to take multiple shots at the same weapon. Didn't get it, got it, right? And not have to worry about, I just wasted 4 interceptors. So I think there's a lot of promise there, and the technology has come an enormous distance, right? This was, I remember Strategic Defense Initiative, even if you guys don't, and I was super jazzed about it. And that's what I wanted to do when I was a little kid, before I decided I wanted to get punched in the face a lot, was I wanted to design directed energy defense systems. And the technology was like really super high tech now, and now it's like, oh yeah, I have a laser in my mouse, right? So laser technology has come an enormously long way, directed energy in general. But there are countermeasures to it, right? Okay, so I'm going to have directed energy, I'm going to put shielding on, okay? That maybe means the warhead is smaller, the missile has to be bigger, but I mean, you still run into the measure-countermeasure fight. So I think there's a real role for directed energy. I just don't think, at least in the near term, it's going to solve the missile defense problem entirely. I think it's got to be a piece of an architecture, and particularly, I think, for close in, right? So the Navy has done a lot of work with sort of close range missile defense. There, I think it looks pretty promising, right? Particularly if you're not talking about nuclear warheads. You're just talking about moving Navy ship, something that hits a missile, even if all it does is make it crash into the water, hey, that's a win. You can also use it to attack UAVs, unmanned sea systems on the surface. I mean, it looks pretty promising there, at least for close range. But I think as the answer, I don't think we're anywhere close to that. Yes, sir. Oh, sorry.
No, please.
Yeah. So understanding that this is like a political question, it depends on like the election in 2020. Do you share the concern of the disarmament community that the U.S. withdrawing from the INF is a precursor to withdrawal from New START?
So, I mean, there's not really a good answer to that. I think INF and New START are related but separate, if that makes sense. So the administration has said publicly it hasn't made a decision on New START extension, and I think that's true. There are a lot of questions about New START even leaving aside INF. So the novel systems I mentioned, are not currently as articulated captured in New START, right? There's nothing in New START about, hey, I think I'll deploy a super long range underwater nuclear torpedo. Oh, and by the way, I'll do the same with a nuclear powered cruise missile. So the US says, we got to talk about these things. Do you extend if the Russians are going to deploy a lot of these that aren't captured by the treaty? It might still be worth it, but I think there's a lot of sort of thinking that has to be done, even apart from, can we trust these guys because they were cheating on INF? So, that's a sort of cop-out answer of, I don't know whether New START ends up extended, but I will highlight one thing, and Kieran and I were talking about it before. Even if you extend New START, it expires in 2026. So there has to be thought, and I would encourage you guys to sort of, if you're looking for a place to put your intellectual energy in terms of arms control and nuclear issues, what's the follow-on look like, right? I mean, you could do more of the same, right? So New START is actually a good treaty in terms of verification procedures, things like that. So you could do, basically New START with some tweaks will capture novel systems. The Russians have publicly raised concerns about some of the things the US has done under New START. Let's work that out and basically just have, New START with tweaks. Is that what you want to do? You could also have more ambitious, let's seek further reductions. You could also say, actually, post New START, we don't think we want anything. So that would be where I would put energy, because it is a really open question. Even if New START is extended, what comes after?
Two questions. The first one is a little bit more inside baseball related to INF. What should we make of the official statements that we need to get out of INF, or may need to get out of INF because of China and what we need to do in China? And just to take a step to be more concrete, what nuclear systems make sense to deploy on land and where in Asia to deal with China? In other words, is that a good argument? And where is it good and where is it kind of weaker?
So, I mean, the good and bad of INF was it covered all delivery systems of that range and type, right? So it meant the US and Russia/Soviet Union couldn't deploy conventional weapons with that range either. Now, when the treaty was signed, that was the very beginning of what we now call the Precision Revolution. So nobody cared. It's like, I'm not going to build a missile to go 4,000 miles and deliver a conventional warhead. Why would I do that? That's stupid. Now it's routine, right? So I think the thinking is, in the first instance, U.S. responses to INF will not necessarily be nuclear, right? They'll be conventional precision strike. There, I think you see some advantages, and they're probably, mirror at least some of the advantages the Russians saw in building their own system that does this. So, a transporter erector launcher, right, basically a truck that you can shoot missiles off of, is cheaper than a plane to shoot missiles off of, right? It's cheaper than a boat to shoot missiles off of. You can move them around pretty quickly, right? They can disperse and hide, and there are ways to find them, but you have to be really good to find them, right? It's really quite difficult if you operate them correctly. So that gives you some survivability. If you're worried about, this bubble of precision strike and air defenses that adversaries can put forward, people call it anti-access area denial, but whatever you want to call it. If you're worried about getting inside that, it would be good if you already had strike systems that were in the bubble to begin with, right? That could disperse and be safe in Europe or potentially in places in Asia. So again, my perspective, I don't think China is the first or even second order reason the US is getting out of INF, but there may be a role for conventional ground-based precision intermediate range strike, say that 3 times fast, in Asia as part of US posture. I don't think it will be nuclear, again, at least in the first instance. Even less likely, again, this is me speculating, even less likely to be nuclear in Asia than in Europe.
Right, and presumably the supplemental nuclear capabilities would address those needs in Asia more than anything.
I would think so. I mean, that's the advantage of both of those supplemental capabilities being based on submarines, is they're pretty survivable as well, though not infinitely so. And they're mobile, right? So you could have potentially use those capabilities in Asia just as well as in Europe.
Okay, second question, which is much broader, and then we're getting near the end here. Okay, we have to step outside of our bubble. How, there's a lot. There are a lot of people who think, that what I teach and what you do for a living is irrelevant. That nuclear weapons are, the ultimate deterrent. No country will take rational steps to engage in nuclear conflict. They're even scared of conventional conflict because it'll escalate to nuclear use. And this is just a really expensive insurance policy for something that just ain't gonna happen. How, in responding to that, I mean, you and I are obviously clearly more skeptical of the nuclear revolution that's transformed international relations, but when you wake up at 3 in the morning, what is the scenario, which scenario just really kind of seems like a plausible path to nuclear use? Is it this guy in a conventional war and he escalates to nuclear use? Is it Russia? What's the most kind of realistic pathway to nuclear weapons being used in international politics?
So I do think it's escalation from a major conventional war. Now, a major conventional war could be on the Indian subcontinent, right? We haven't had a war there a serious war in more than 40 years, but it's not to be ruled out at some point. I also think, Caitlin Talmadge, who's a professor here, has written a lot about this, the potential for conventional conflict to go nuclear more quickly than sort of is believed, due to a lot of the new capabilities we've sort of talked about, right? So, and again, nuclear command and control, I think, is at the heart of a lot of these issues, right? So, you're in a crisis with a country, and suddenly parts of your nuclear command and control system start acting funny. Is that because you've been compromised, right? That somebody has used either attack through the supply chain or through cyber operations to start to get after your command and control? Or is that just stuff happens in a crisis, right? So people start to get a little antsy. Then that crisis escalates into war. Things start behaving funny. Then you have maybe conventional attacks. Directed energy systems can be directed at satellites just as well as missiles, probably even better against satellites, right? So suddenly part of your command and control system goes blind. Another part is acting funny. Part of your communications architecture is being jammed, right? So this, to me, is the pathway I worry the most about, is a conventional conflict between nuclear-armed adversaries where stability is starting to break down very quickly because of conventional cyber special operations. A host of capabilities that are quite difficult to figure out exactly what's going on, even in peacetime, much less in an actual shooting war. And one side basically says, if I don't act now, then I'm not going to have the opportunity to act in the future because my command and control will be neutralized, my forces can be targeted with offensive operations, and I'm out of the game. So better I use maybe a limited nuclear use, maybe I'll use 1 or 2 nuclear weapons just to convince the other side I'm serious and it's time to knock it off, right? That's a lot of the argument about what the Russian theory of nuclear use is. Same could be true of the DPRK, right? The shadow of regime change would hang over almost any conflict between the US and South Korea with the DPRK. So that, to me, is the worry, is conventional conflict that could go nuclear, I think, much more rapidly than people anticipate, as one side feels sort of the potential for nuclear deterrence slipping away. That, to the extent anything other than my 6-month-old keeps me awake at night, that's what
Yeah. Any other questions? Is it okay if anybody would like to come up and talk to
Yeah.
you? Stick around
Sure,
for a few
absolutely.
minutes. For my news class, we are actually taking a field trip to your office at the end of April. You might, Greg Weaver and Rob are going to host us, so you might be seeing many of us again. You're always welcome to come back. I again, personally feel fortunate as a U.S. citizen that someone like Austin is in government and in the Pentagon working on these issues. When he left academia, it was a huge loss for academia. But to then go into the trenches, into the policy arena is, again, I just think more than makes up for the loss in the academy. Although then we no longer have publications, many publications as before. Join me in thanking Austin.